This is a response to a dialogue between Professor Anton Corey and Immendham, or Gary. And the debate that they were having was centering around a few things, but I would say primarily the ability to have children and what kind of boundaries ought to be put in place, if any, and what kind of responsibility are we taking in that sense. You do sense there's an agreement in general that there's an issue that does loom in the sense that there's only a finite amount of resources, and only so many people can, in some sense, survive on a particular planet. Although, so there's a few things I want to say about this. Immendham is kind of taking the determinist stance. And there's a lot of genius in that, and I'm going to, in a sense, argue for it, but I don't also. And then, on the other hand, we have Professor Anton, who's taking sort of more of an integrative approach, in my opinion. But there's a few loose ends on both sides, and I'm not saying I have all of the ways to tie it up, but I have some suggestions on this. So one of the things that seems at the heart of this is the whole notion of values. Now, you can look at this deterministically in the sense that, even if this is just a consequential reality of, ideas stacking on ideas, culture itself, which is explained away through frisky dirt, or the evolution of dirt, there's still, nevertheless, this reality that there's a complexification in some sense of values. Now, you might just say that that's meaningless, that inherently in the universe there's no kind of real meaning to that complexity. But what is happening with this argument that Gary is himself suggesting that he's got the better notion? So he's suggesting that his views are in that way more complex. So in that sense, he ought to be agreed with. And this is an important point in that he is therefore saying that there's a hierarchy of valuing. And therefore, that if that's not the case, then it's arbitrary to the choices that we make. I mean, in a certain way, you can still tentatively hold that position, but then it's useless to even argue. In a certain way, in the sense that why would you even present it if you don't believe that it's worth presenting? So then we get into the heart of valuing itself. So I would say that in a certain regard, and I'm very much in favor of the prescription of having people as scientifically educated as possible, but simultaneously there's the danger of reducing or not taking into mind the whole nature of the hermeneutical process, and or just the process of understanding other, so that your perspective, by its very nature, by the fact, if you want to take the deterministic perspective, by the locality and the kind of the circumstances of your life, you're going to have a different perspective than me. However, in the interaction between you and I, and we understand each other, there is an aha moment. Oh, I've never put things together in that way. In that sense, it is more complex because you offer a perspective that I just never had. And so this is a different sort of thing than science itself. And I think even if you want to talk about it deterministically, it ought to be valued in its own kind of domain, in the domain of hermeneutics, which again cannot be reduced in a certain sense to into the kinds of sciences that we would prescribe as empiricism or behaviorism. It's just a different kind of process, one of interpretation. That is to say that, how is Hamlet to be interpreted? Okay, well, I think generally people would say that there's better and worse kinds of interpretations of Hamlet, but maybe not necessarily the one right way. In some sense, there probably was a way. The intentions that Shakespeare had and the perspective that Shakespeare had were particular, arguably, to him. However, there's going to be more and less proximity to the kind of interpretation that he had. And so people that study lots of Shakespeare and go through lots of his works are going to get probably, not necessarily, a closer sort of mind space to Shakespeare and therefore have sort of credentials for doing that. And that is a matter of interpretation in different ways slightly than science. This is that whole broad sort of avenue, I'd say, of justness, in the sense of am I doing justice or justness to the kind of perspective that you have? And something about how Gary presents himself, in my opinion, is one in which, although I do consider him a genius, he doesn't want to really step into the other perspective, I'd say. And there's in a certain way good reason for that, because he's very defined in his boundaries of thought. He's concretized them in a very strong way so that he can present them to other. And that any sort of penetration into that idea system makes it a little bit less strong. It makes it more flimsy in that way, because it's not, it's like you're ripping holes in your idea system every time you kind of let in another idea. So there's a vulnerability that's kind of involved in that process. So getting back to how that sort of fits into perhaps the question of population is in the idea that if we start to revalue valuing, or the broad perspective-taking process, there's going to be, in my opinion, more education and or probably better decisions being made in how the choices about having a child is just going to be more complex, because you've taken on more perspectives of that. In the following way, presently, there's a scary sort of fact that our culture right now, the graduating class of last year, was the most narcissistic ever since the scores of narcissism have started. And what that means is that there's an inability of people our age to actually take the perspective of other, to hold that view of other in one's mind's eye, and thereby being able to kind of reiterate in a fairly robust way what the other's sort of thinking, feeling, etc. And why that's scary is that the more isolated ones, there's a sense of nihilism, there's a sense of purposelessness in that you start to just experience reality as a self that doesn't have any connection to other, at least as far as a being of valuing other. Again, this can all be explained, in my opinion, deterministically. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. So that, the more isolated your mind system is, that is to say, you're not allowing any penetration of it, any vulnerability of that mind system, so that the interpretation doesn't allow itself to cycle and thereby enhance itself, then we're getting into sort of a kind of stagnation of valuing, or that broad spectrum of interpretive modality. There is something to be said about the strong person that doesn't allow anything in. There's, because it offers that sort of bouncing off of, this person has made such a stable ground that, it challenges you to sort of react to it, to come up with a better solution, perhaps, or something along these lines. And therefore, I would say that there's been a reduction away from the whole importance of the development of values, the whole embrace of trying to complexify one's values. Now, you could say that attempt to try is just a deterministic process. It doesn't really matter. What it does matter is that through that, there's sort of a meaningfulness in it, in that, there's lots of aha moments. I never thought of it that way. Aha! I kind of get a new way of looking at you. Aha! It's very similar in that sense, but different to art. Art is more of an individual creation, where you kind of, in your own mind, come up with these ideas. And I would say that, Gary Immendham is a sort of thought artist, an artist that has defined himself very autonomously from other. But there's that danger that you do that and you're just enhancing that sort of narcissism, that you're not allowing anybody else into your mind realm, or you're pushing it on them in a certain sense, and not yet kind of having that give and take of I have that danger too in a certain way. I know that in me too. But I'm trying to say that valuing this communicative element of give and take is important for the enhancement of culture and for solving these very tricky issues of community, where imposing laws on other is going to cause a sort of resentment, and is going to have a feedback in society. Anyway, like just looking at it empirically, looking at it as a deterministic structure, you impose limits or limitations on how one is going to live, there's going to be resultant consequences of that imposition, in that, if nothing else, there's going to be, psychological questions about why aren't they letting me, why can't I, what's going on, why aren't I even allowed to question this, etc. Maybe, the forum could be very open, but still, I think that for many people there would be a sense of injustice here, unless we educate people to somehow have a degree of a very high degree of openness on the issues of these things, which I don't think Gary's necessarily saying we ought not do, but I am suggesting that that this is the key to moving this debate forward, is that we have to start valuing the whole developmental process of value. And I do believe it is a growth process, developmental psychology kind of growth process in that sense. Thanks for listening.